The next item of business today is a member's business debate on motion number 3569 in the name of Sarah Boyack on fair access to the legal profession. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I would now invite members who wish to speak in this debate to please press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible, and I would also remind those leaving the gallery and indeed the chamber to do so as quietly as possible, please, to allow the debate to proceed. Now call on Sarah Boyack to open the debate. 7 minutes, please, Ms Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And first of all, I want to thank the students from the Campaign for Fair Access to the Legal Profession who got in touch to alert me to their concerns about changes to funding for students wishing to take the Diploma in Professional Legal Practice. Without their commitment, we wouldn't be having this debate today. And I do also want to thank colleagues from across the Chamber for being prepared to sign my motion and to support my call for action. Changes to loans available for the DPLP have made it harder for students from low incomes to become lawyers. There are more loans, but they're smaller loans, and they don't begin to cover students' living costs. These changes make a bad situation worse. And parliamentary questions I've received answers to suggest this wasn't anticipated and is an unintended consequence, but it needs to be addressed. I was first alerted to the challenge facing students by my constituent Helen. She is now £20,000 in debt, although she is an award-winning student. Students should not have to face such huge financial barriers. And as the NUS report, 5 times as many entrants to LLB degrees come from the least deprived backgrounds compared to the most deprived. And then if a student wants to be a lawyer, the postgraduate diploma is absolutely essential. It provides the vocational skills and knowledge required for becoming a qualified lawyer. It's interesting to note that in England, universities are increasingly incorporating those vocational elements into undergraduate degree courses. In Scotland, we now have a major access for students on low incomes due to the lack of decent loans to cover maintenance costs. But the DPLP is only one of 7 years of a commitment that the vast majority of potential Scottish lawyers need to sign up to. The 4-year honours degree, the DPLP, then 2 years professional practice on very modest salaries of around £16,000. That is a very long time to cover in terms of living costs and paying back the substantial costs supporting yourself and possibly your family through those long 7 years. And it should concern us all that the postgraduate tuition fee loan, introduced for 2012-13, covers the cost of tuition for up to a maximum of only £3,500, despite the course fees alone being considerably higher. So it isn't cheap. And that means students have to borrow money from elsewhere or have already saved up thousands required to pay their fees and supporting themselves. The Postgraduate and Career Development Loan is an unsuitable alternative source of funding for students from low-income backgrounds because of interest levels and restrictive payment conditions. They're a major barrier to students from low-income backgrounds. Repayment of the loan begins almost immediately after graduation, irrespective of a student's income. And in the current climate, there's absolutely no guarantee it will be possible to gain employment in the legal profession and therefore afford the repayments. And banks are charging higher fees, higher interest rates, and are much more risk-averse. These measures limit the career options for many students in Lothian and across the country. They certainly don't widen access to the legal profession. It's been suggested to me that I shouldn't be concerned, as the income generation opportunities for lawyers are excellent. Well, for some, maybe, but should that really be the driving motivation for all our prospective lawyers? What price social justice? What sort of legal system will we end up with? The profession will end up the preserve of those who can afford the 7 years of limited income and the build-up of significant debt, not an attractive prospect during a recession. An inevitable consequence of the expense of the DPLP is that it forces graduates to seek the legal traineeships, which will lead to the highest maximum returns. I'm told the majority of trainees end up working for larger legal firms in Edinburgh, less than 10% working for sole practitioners, clear implications for the provision of legal services in less commercially viable areas. In rural areas, health boards can commission staff to work in communities that are doctors. But what about the provision of legal services in rural areas? In the long run, What will be the attraction for people to set up practices when there are much more lucrative options to be followed in our cities? And the channeling of new graduates to the largest legal firms has implications for the less lucrative fields too. As an MSP, I've referred many constituents to free legal advice at Edinburgh University. But in the future, will those students be able to provide that service when they've got to work? Affordable access to legal advice is already hard to come by, and spreading loans more thinly with a smaller amount offered means that students from lower income circumstances will be deeply disadvantaged, and we should be concerned, not just on the behalf of those students who will find it harder to stay the course over the full 7 years, but for the health of the legal profession as a whole. As the Campaign for Fair Access to the Legal Profession put it, a representative legal profession underpins a fair legal system and a just society. I welcome the support from NUS Scotland to add their voice for action from the Scottish Government. In all the parliamentary questions I've asked, I haven't seen any acknowledgement that the SNP Government understands those concerns. We all know that money's tight. Surely all the more reason for a proper rationale for how investment in the next generation of lawyers is spent. I hope the Minister will commit to act today. Scotland cannot afford a legal system that is closed only to those from the highest income backgrounds. It isn't fair, and it won't lead to a legal system built on the principles of access to all. It will not let us build the Scotland we all aspire to. My proposal is that the Minister should convene a summit, pulling together students, NUS Scotland, the Law Society, representatives from a variety of legal firms and universities, and members from the Justice and Education Committees. There are potentially a range of solutions that could be developed, and there would be absolutely no loss of face for the Cabinet Secretary if he was to do that now. We would welcome his action, we would support his action, and we could then find a way forward together. We have to do better. We need a legal system that's open and that it's accessible, and that's important not just for our students struggling now, but for generations to come. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call on Marco Biaggi to be followed by Lewis MacDonald. 4 minutes, please.
Well, let me begin by thanking Sarah Boyack for securing this debate, although it was quite ironic to be hearing about access to university from the party that introduced tuition fees. But to move on, I do believe that it is important to have a legal system that is open to all, but I also believe it's important to have more widely a postgraduate system that is open to all. And while I recognise that we already have the best funded postgraduate system in the UK, there is no incompatibility between recognising that and arguing that we could do even more. So I'll go straight into a suggestion that may interest potential postgraduates, whether they're studying law or indeed any other subject. According to the spending plans that are currently set out, the AME for net student loans advanced will rise from £408.3 million next year to £468.3 million the year after. Now, assuming inflation of all the current commitments and everything else being equal, that should leave around £50 million in genuine additional resource. Now, that's a rare thing in government these days, and there'll be a lot of deserving student causes coming knocking at the Minister's door for a share of that funding. We've already had an unprecedented uplift in the core living cost support for undergraduates this year, and my inbox is twitching with the anticipation of more emails asking for further increases. There's also the long-running question of part-time students. So it's clear that postgraduates themselves are not the sole demand on this. But postgraduates are expected to study full-time with limited support from public funds, especially for their living costs. So on their behalf, let me make a gentle tap on the door. The recent report from the European Commission entitled National Student Fee and Support Systems 2011-12 showed that Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom were poles apart for student funding. The UK had the highest undergraduate tuition fees in Europe, while Scotland ranked alongside the mainstream social democratic countries such as Austria, Denmark, Finland, Norway and Sweden in upholding free access to an undergraduate education. It's good news, and it shows that the trend, which is supposedly irreversible to ever higher fees, which have been backed by administrations of many colours, is no such thing. The report, however, noted that Scotland was the only one of those 5 nations to charge routinely, however, for what it called the second cycle or as we would call it, postgraduate education. Now, postgraduate education is fragmented and it's unregulated, but there's a creativity to the chaos out there, professional, applied or purely academic. And in some cases, in fact, in that chaos, the professional bodies pick up the cost. And it is perhaps fair to ask why the legal profession, not one known for its penury, doesn't carry a bit more of the cost of professional legal training, as, for example, accountancy does. But you couldn't consolidate all of those into one system for an undergraduate-style entitlement without tampering with the healthy variety. And overall, that wouldn't be helpful. But with the resources available and bearing in mind the other competing priorities, I do think some form of creative, targeted and well-designed funding scheme to help expand access to postgraduate education by funding fees and living costs for individuals from lower income backgrounds isn't beyond the wit of man. And if it is not beyond the wit of man, it is definitely not beyond the formidable wit of the Cabinet Secretary for Education. So I would suggest to the Minister and indeed the Government that when they come around to looking at the student loans budget for 2014-15, an enterprise soon to be, if not already underway, that they look closely at whether such a scheme to help postgraduates in the round can be developed. It will be entirely in keeping with the Scottish Government's already exemplary record in opening the doors to higher education.
Thank you very much. Now call on Lewis MacDonald to be followed by David McLetchie.
Thank you very much. Tomorrow marks the start of the legal year, and I and no doubt other colleagues will be joining members of the legal profession to mark that important point in the calendar. And it's therefore a good moment to reflect on the nature of that profession and its important role in wider society. And I congratulate Sarah Boyack on giving us that opportunity in today's debate. As she has pointed out, the costs of entry to the legal profession can be a formidable barrier to access. Aspiring lawyers from low-income backgrounds have to be prepared for 7 years of study and training before they can earn enough to begin to pay back their costs, even if they are lucky enough in the current climate to secure a permanent job. The Diploma in Professional Legal Practice is part of that, and unlike many other postgraduate qualifications, law students have no choice but to complete the diploma if they want to go on to become solicitors. That means that the funding system has to be carefully designed to ensure the diploma year is affordable for poorer students. And sadly, as the Campaign for Fair Access to the Legal Profession has pointed out, the funding system is currently moving in the wrong direction. That campaign for fairer access is led by law students across Scotland, including in my home city of Aberdeen, and other members from the North East will be aware of the great work done by law students through the Aberdeen Law Project, helping people to access justice, including no-liability legal advice through MSPs and MPs to their constituents. The concern for social justice that motivates those students also underpins this campaign. Law students who are concerned with access to justice for clients on low incomes are right to highlight the issue of access to the legal profession for students from families of modest means. And socially aware law students like those in Aberdeen might go on, after completing their diploma, to train in law centres, in the public sector, or indeed in the Procurator Fiscal Service, all of which do essential work, but which do not, in general, offer the prospect of large financial returns in the way the largest law firms are able to do. So to enable students, or graduates rather, to make that choice, it's important that government should seek to mitigate against the obvious disadvantages faced by students from poorer backgrounds. Campaigners, however, believe that the changes currently being made have struck the wrong balance by providing loans to more students rather than larger loans to students who need them most. And, of course, those loans are enough to help meet the costs of fees alone. But diploma students have also lost access to maintenance support in the last couple of years, so the scale of debt that they will then require to take forward into their professional lives will be all the greater. Nobody, I hope, seriously pretends that it is possible to secure higher education on a large scale without students incurring debt. The issue is how much debt and whether it is so great and over so long a period as to make that particular route of study unaffordable to large numbers of people. That is the risk here, but that risk can be avoided if the government will at least recognise that there is a problem. There are a number of possible solutions, as Sarah Boyack has said. The diploma year could be incorporated in the first degree, as happens elsewhere, and as applies to the equivalent stage in education and training in medicine or dentistry. Alternatively, diploma students could be allowed to apply for a student loan to cover their living costs as well as their fees, as postgraduate student architects and teachers already can do. I hope that what we will hear today is that ministers at least recognise that there is a problem and that they will act on Sarah Boyack's suggestion of a summit of all those with an interest in improving access to the legal profession. I believe, as Sarah Boyack has said, that if ministers do not recognise that, we will all be the poorer for it.
Thank you very much. I now call on David McLetchie to be followed by Jenny Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The debate today is about how we ensure that students with the ability and the desire to become solicitors in Scotland are not deterred by a lack of financial support. And I note that the Law Society of Scotland and the Campaign for Fair Access to the Legal Profession, representing all 10 Scottish universities offering undergraduate law degrees, have expressed concern about the Scottish Government's policy. Now, the Diploma in Professional Legal Practice, as other speakers have indicated, is a postgraduate course, but one which is compulsory in order to qualify as a solicitor in Scotland. And for 2012-2013, the fees for the diploma are between £5,200 and £6,300. In previous academic years, 300 of the most able students received SASASS grants of £3,400, and the remaining 358 students in 2012 were fully self-funding. Now, the Scottish Government announced last year that this arrangement would change and that all students taking the diploma would receive a loan of up to £3,400, and this was, in his typical fashion, loudly trumpeted by the Cabinet Secretary for Education, Michael Russell, as more than doubling the amount of diploma students who would be funded. But the reality of the situation is that while more students will receive funding by way of loans, but not grants, the level of loan support is grossly inadequate, particularly for a course which is required in order to qualify for a profession. Fees for the diploma for 2012-13 are between £5,200 and £6,300, while the maximum loan is only £3,400, and the support available is therefore too limited to help those students who cannot self-fund. Now, the Scottish Government argues that alternatives are available in the form of professional and career development loans, but these loans have commercial interest rates, must be paid back regardless of subsequent employment, and are not available to all. Further, the Government's proposed funding arrangement for the diploma treats law students unfairly compared to students taking similar postgraduate professional courses in architecture, teaching, medical, veterinary and dental students who receive maintenance loans for their entire pre-qualification studies. Yet law students who have to do the diploma in order to qualify only receive a loan towards roughly half the cost of the course. On the latter point, I think the Government appears to have fallen prey to the one-size-fits-all mentality. Postgraduate loan of £3,400 will apply to postgraduate courses with very different fees. And as I said before, the diploma typically has a fee in excess of £5,200, but the majority of other courses funded by the loan cost £3,400 or £3,750. And it therefore seems unfair that a diploma student only has access to the same maximum loan as a student studying a course costing up to £2,000 less. And these courses are generally very specialist, and while some Scottish ministers might benefit from a course from Robert Gordon University in corporate communications with public affairs, such a course is clearly not essential for career progression, unlike the diploma. Now, the Campaign for Fair Access has identified this inconsistency, and it argues that the Scottish Government's policy will discourage law students from low-income families entering the legal profession. As one who did so myself in these circumstances, I find that a particularly disturbing prospect. An analysis of UCAS data by the Law Society suggests that relative to all other subjects, law performs slightly worse in terms of the proportion of students from lower income groups. There is a
Grateful
risk
if you draw to a
that
close,
the Scottish
please.
Government's policy will make matters even worse. Presiding Officer, the issue at the root of this anomaly is equity. One group of students undertaking a professional qualification is subject to a different funding regime, which can only impact negatively on access to the legal profession. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Jenny Mara to be followed by Roderick Campbell.
I thank and congratulate my colleague Sarah Boyack for bringing this debate to the Chamber today, because it is perhaps the only way that we will get a proper airing of this issue, because it falls between two of the Government's portfolio areas, education and legal affairs. I believe it is an issue for justice and legal affairs because I think the new funding structure for the legal profession will lead to a creeping elitism of the profession. A student going to study the legal diploma now can take a loan to cover half the £9,000 fees and is not entitled to apply for a student loan to cover maintenance costs. The only option is for a career development loan at commercial rates. Why is this a problem? It's a problem because a fifth-year student at school from a low-income family, having gained good grades in her Highers, will be looking at options to study at university. She will have worked hard and gained good enough grades to study law and will be investigating the cost of studying until she starts work. A law graduate, as my colleagues have said, cannot start practising law without their legal diploma, so the pupil factors those costs into her calculations. The cost of the legal diploma is prohibitive. My pupil in question eliminates law from their considerations. A student from a richer family who will be able to rely on their parents to see them through the more expensive diploma presses on with their application, aware that it will be more expensive, but knowing that their private circumstances will see them through. Apart from the inequality this creates for students themselves, it results in a more homogenous, more privileged legal profession. And why is that a problem? If we have an increasingly privileged legal profession, with no experience, limited appreciation or empathy with some of the difficult and chaotic circumstances people find themselves in, the profession's ability to properly represent their clients and the interests of society will be weakened. Like this Parliament, the legal profession needs a range of people with different stories, privileges, testing times and financial circumstances to reach balanced and sensible remedies and judgments for the benefit of everyone in society. The Cabinet Secretary has dismissed concerns on this when I have raised them in the Chamber before. But I want to tell the Minister today that there are law professors and practising lawyers working in Scotland today who are very concerned about the new funding arrangements and have made representations to me and to my colleagues. In my view, the Cabinet Secretary for Education has drawn a very arbitrary line between undergraduate and postgraduate study. It's far too simplistic and has consequences, perhaps unintended, but consequences nonetheless. I suggest that the Cabinet Secretary might want to reconsider a funding structure for law students and for others similarly affected by this arbitrary cut-off between undergraduate and postgraduate, the situation of educational psychology students, they are similarly affected. The Minister might want to consider a structure that guarantees consistent funding arrangements from the start of study to the point of entry into the professions where people can start earning money. I think that only when this funding is consistent will students from poorer backgrounds be able to again consider studying law to the point of entry to the profession. I would also like to back my colleague Sarah Boyack's calls for a summit on this matter to discuss it in full and find a solution. But I would also say to the Minister that he could very quickly make a difference to this situation
draw to a close, please.
by allowing students to apply for maintenance loans to cover their maintenance costs.
Thank you very much. Now call on Roderick Campbell to be followed by Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to refer to my declaration of interest as a member of the Faculty of Advocates. I'd like to congratulate Sarah Boyack on securing this subject as members' business and for bringing the issue to the Chamber. And may I also acknowledge the very professional campaign of the CFALP. I have raised this issue in correspondence with the Cabinet Secretary and also raised the issue in the Chamber at question time on the 31st of May. I think it's safe to say that this is not an issue that's going to go away. We have, of course, as a society, moved a long way from the days when prospective lawyers paid premiums for their apprenticeships, even if minimum salaries for trainees, and indeed the diploma itself, are comparatively modern phenomena, depending on your age. But certainly in my view, students undertaking the diploma in professional legal practice are at a particular financial disadvantage when compared with their peers seeking to qualify as doctors, dentists and vets. Part of that, I believe, is because of the nature of the law degree itself. Traditionally, a law degree has been perceived as an education in itself, unlike the training for vets, dentists or doctors. And accordingly, the smooth transition to the diploma as part of essential professional training is obscured. But my own view is that the diploma should not be considered as just another postgraduate degree. To that extent, therefore, I disagree with the NUS. The Cabinet Secretary has made the Scottish Government's position clear. He's talked about tough choices. CFALP, in contrast, make reference to the position in relation to loans for fees and to the benefit some DLP students will now receive under the new postgraduate arrangements. They have a point. But it is, of course, the case that for the very wealthiest, a loan for tuition fees may not be a consideration at all. This debate is, however, not just about fees and loans. It's also about the makeup of our legal profession. As the campaign group have already pointed out, the socioeconomic profile of those entering the legal profession is narrow, with disproportionate numbers from the very wealthiest in our society. Without a doubt, we have a long way to go to reach the point where the legal profession reflects the economic and social diversity of modern Scotland. The reality is, however, that poorer students may well be deterred from the DPLP despite tuition fee support, but not only because of the maintenance issue, but also because of the substantial difficulties in obtaining training contracts and the rather slim chance of getting firms to support them on the diploma. We must, I think, acknowledge that by reforming the Postgraduate Student Allowances Scheme, the Scottish Government was able to extend support for tuition fees with postgraduate loans for about 5,000 students full and part-time. That has not been replicated elsewhere in the United Kingdom. In previous answers to me, however, the Cabinet Secretary has argued that living cost support should be available through personal career development loans. Presiding Officer, those loans are, to my knowledge, offered by 3 high street banks and may be an attractive source of income for students who will have a handsomely paid job immediately after graduating. Unfortunately, that's not a prospect many young people expect. Career development loan repayments must commence immediately after graduation, and the banks advise students that they must ensure they can afford monthly repayments before agreeing to the terms of the loan. Many students can't make that commitment. I fully accept, of course, that the diploma should not be for the faint-hearted, particularly in current times when training contracts are very difficult to obtain, and no one today should be embarking on the diploma without a full appreciation of the risks involved. I also remind the Chamber that to proceed to the bar, to the Faculty of Advocates, not only is a diploma required, but generally speaking a period of develling of about 8 months, which is unpaid, although a few comparatively modest scholarships or bursaries are available. And that will certainly deter young or many not so young lawyers from humble backgrounds from taking that path. More generally, however, I think we ought to look at experience south of the border. Consideration of alternatives to the LLB, modern apprenticeships, are something which are increasingly being pioneered by some large firms in the south, and that operates as a financial benefit to the new apprentices.
If you draw to a close, please.
It's not entirely clear how far the Law Society is championing that concept here. In conclusion, it's clear to any reasonable person that the Scottish Government is under enormous pressure, but I would hope that the Cabinet Secretary will continue to keep this issue under review.
Thank you very much. Due to the number of members still wishing to speak in the debate, I am minded to accept a motion under Rule 8.14.3 that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes. Ms Boyack, would you like to move the motion?
I so move a motion.
Thank you very much. The motion is, are we all agreed that a motion under Rule 8.14.3 be agreed to extend the debate by up to 30 minutes? Thank you. I now call on Graham Pearson to be followed by Liam MacArthur. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I begin by congratulating Sarah Boyack on securing this debate, and I feel sure that the Minister sitting with us will realise by now there is a genuine problem here to resolve. It is important that we have confidence in our system of justice and believe that those who are responsible for the administration and delivering justice on our behalf by legislation or precedent do so with a degree of empathy as well as skill. Is that confidence undermined if those of means can seek employment in the legal profession and by consequence the judiciary? Is it important that those who make up the legal profession are there because of their knowledge, skill and talent alone, rather than the financial support they are lucky enough to receive from family? If we believe that it is, then it is surely important that there is a fair access to the legal profession from people of all backgrounds. Does the present system deliver that fair access? A diploma in professional legal practice is an essential to practice law as the professional graduate diploma in education is to teach. However, students who study for the education diploma can apply for maintenance loans and their fees are paid by the Scottish Government. The same is also the case for students for certain postgraduate diplomas in architecture. Students studying for diplomas in professional legal practice, on the other hand, apply for a tuition fee loan of £3,400, which covers approximately half of the cost of the fees and materials, depending on the institution attended. There is no longer any support for maintenance for these students, and if any student does have funds to pay the balance of the fees and materials, doesn't have funds, they are being directed to a bank to apply for a professional career development loan. If they are successful in obtaining such a loan, it will be lent at commercial rates and be paid back from 1 month after graduation, irrespective of employment situation. These changes have been introduced by government with great haste and, in the view of the Law Society, inadequate consultation. The disparity is very clear. The Law Society of Scotland is concerned by any move which risks discouraging talented students from progressing with their ambition of becoming a solicitor because they are unable to fund their studies or are reluctant to take on further debt. I have to say I share their concerns and the concerns of fellow members in this chamber. At the end of their university studies leading to the diploma year, many students will have as much as £15,000 in student loans. The thought of an additional debt for a student with little means of financial support is worrying for the young person concerned in the current financial climate, but it should also be of greater concern to this chamber. I hope the Minister reconsiders.
Thank you very much. Now call on Liam MacArthur to be followed by Kezia Dugdale.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I add my congratulations to Sarah Boyack on securing today's debate. Welcome the opportunity to participate in and thank those who have provided briefings. As the Education Secretary never tires of reminding the Chamber, one of the central principles of Scottish education is that academic ability should always be prized above the ability to pay. By removing all grants for law diploma students and preventing them from making use of affordable, accessible loans to cover living costs, the Scottish Government, despite Mr Viagi's most loyal of assertions, is, I think, failing to honour that principle. Not surprisingly, NUS Scotland have confirmed their support for the campaign for fair access to the legal profession and the wider aims of ensuring that access to any profession is based on talent and not on financial circumstances. Indeed, this reflects a growing support for the campaign, including the Scottish Young Lawyers Association, who have criticised not only the discrepancies between the treatment of those entering the legal profession and those entering other professions, but also the lack of consultation in advance of those changes, a point made by Graham Pearson. While I would be inclined to agree with NUS Scotland that there should be an expectation on institutions to do more to support legal diploma students, and that there is still an important role for potential employers to, as is the case in the rest of the UK, this does not, I think, absolve the Government of responsibility for these students. It may be the case that the supply of law diploma graduates remains adequate, but they will come from an increasingly narrow section of society, something that runs contrary to the access agenda being pursued by ministers more generally, and which I think enjoys cross-party support. I think Sarah Boyack and Roderick Campbell made some interesting observations about disincentives to pursue careers in less well-paying careers and in rural practices as well. Clearly, one of the points that has particularly angered those heading up the campaign for fair access and others is, as David McCletchie suggested, the extent to which law graduates appear to be being singled out. Postgraduate architecture students, for example, already benefit from 5 years of loan support, as do those training for medical, dental and the veterinary professions. Nevertheless, while as the Law Society of Scotland makes clear, quote, in order to qualify and practice as a solicitor, you must complete the diploma in professional legal practice. Similar support is simply not available for these students. The diploma is essential as it acts as a vocational bridge between the academic degree and the practical nature of a traineeship, and allows students to develop their practical skills in a real-life but controlled environment. So it seems difficult to see what Minister's objection is to levelling the playing field, ensuring that the DPLP, who need financial support most, do actually receive it. Extending the provision of a means-tested student loan for an extra year for these students would be simple to administer and would adhere to the precedent set for other required professional postgraduate programmes. Such a proposal would result in just 0.75% more student loans for SAS to authorise. Nevertheless, it has the potential to widen markedly access to the legal profession. As I say, I do appreciate that there is perhaps more that the sector itself could and should be doing. Indeed, from my discussions with the leaders of the campaign for fair access, this is recognised by them as well. Perhaps, therefore, a solution lies in ministers agreeing to address the anomaly over the immediate term, but tasking the profession to come up with a workable model that can be put in place for the medium to long term. I think Sarah Boyack's idea of a summit may be a logical catalyst for those discussions. But by making clear the time-limited nature of any support, ministers can help send a strong message that this is an issue they expect to see resolved sooner rather than later. I believe this would also send a welcome signal of the government's commitment to widening access across the board, including for those seeking to pursue legal careers. In their briefing, the Campaign for Fair Access state that, quote, a legal system cannot hope to fairly reflect the needs and interests of all elements of society if it is drawn solely from one section of that society. It seems difficult to argue with such a sentiment. I'm pleased to support this motion, congratulate Sarah Boyack once more on helping shine a light on this issue again, and look forward to hearing the Minister's response to a problem that, as Roderick Campbell, I think, rightly observed, will not be going away. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Kezia Dugdale to be followed by Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And like colleagues, can I thank my friend Sarah Boyack for bringing this motion to the Chamber today, and also welcome the opportunity to talk about widening access in the more general sense. I look forward to more debates of that nature in the Chamber in the coming month. I know that we will talk about higher education quotas in line with the Government's legislative programme, and I think you can tell by the number of Labour MSPs in the Chamber that there's a real appetite to look at the issues behind widening access that simply aren't about tuition fees. I have a long-standing interest and passion in the interest of widening access through my previous roles at Edinburgh University Students' Association and at the National Union of Students. And I'm also a law graduate, so I'll talk specifically about the issues that face law students today. But can I first of all turn to address Marco Biagi's speech? He said that Labour MSPs had a cheek to bring this issue to the Chamber because of tuition fees. When will the SNP understand that widening access is about so much more than tuition fees itself? There are so many issues behind it. He actually stood up today and said that his government had an exemplary record of opening the doors to higher education. In his own constituency, Edinburgh University have a record of just 3.9% of their students studying law coming from the most deprived backgrounds in Scotland. It is the second worst record in the whole of Scotland. The only university that does worse than that is Aberdeen University, which is the institution that I went to, and I will talk about that in a second, Presiding Officer. Widening access can be about a number of things. It can be the course choices you have at school, it can be the aspirations or indeed the fears that your parents have for your future. It can be about the encouragement you get from school and your teachers. It can be about whether you really think university is a place for you. And there is a whole issue here about getting more people from the legal profession into classrooms at the earliest stage to talk about different legal careers. When I went to study law, I was inspired by Ally McBeal. That was the big television programme at the time. I wanted to be a courtroom lawyer like Ally McBeal. And it was only when I got to university that I realised that criminal law, or that courtroom type of law, was only 1/16 of the LLB programme that I was there to study, and that I had to do tax law and families and trusts. And I'm afraid, Presiding Officer, all the things that bored me senseless for 4 years at university, there's an important point there, because it's about students understanding the type of education or experiences they'll have when they get to university before they get there. And a lot of that is about retention and what happens to students when they actually get to university and their ability to stay there. And there's two comments I want to make about cost and culture in the short time that I've got left. At Aberdeen University, I was surrounded by people who were privately educated. Now, I come from a middle-class background. Both my parents are teachers. I went to a state school, but I still found that incredibly intimidating. Can you imagine what it would be like to go into that environment if you came from a really deprived background? I don't know how people would cope. I simply just cannot get my head around it. And from the day dot, from word go at Aberdeen University, all these people from privately educated backgrounds were already on the mission of trying to secure their traineeship. It was all about accessing the next path into their careers. And they were able to work for free in legal firms over the summer, and to do that whole work experience angle that I and my friends couldn't do because we had to work during the summer to get enough money to stay at university to continue. Those networks just open and continue to grow when you're at university. Widening access goes right through your entire education, and there are so many cultural issues here that we need to address. It's about opportunities and networks. The final issue is about cost. Students that study law have huge amounts of initial upfront costs in terms of the textbooks they have to access. I spent hundreds of pounds in the first few weeks of my days as a law student buying the books. You can't buy them second-hand. They change every year because the law by its very nature changes every year. We don't give students the ability to cope with these additional costs. That's just two issues, Presiding Officer. There are a whole range of issues here, and I strongly urge the Minister to take on board Sarah Boyack's request for a summit and really make some serious progress on the issue of widening access.
Thank you very much. I now call on Alison Johnson to be followed by Drew Smith.
Okay. Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank Sarah Boyack for bringing this extremely important topic to the Chamber today. The question of who has access to the legal profession must be of interest to all who are interested in social and legal justice in Scotland. I'd like to congratulate the Campaign for Fair Access to the Legal Profession for presenting such a clear and compelling case, and to thank the Law Society for their briefing on the issues facing those who aim for a career in the profession. The Campaign Steering Group represents those law schools offering undergraduate LLB across the campuses of Scotland's law schools, and their campaign has been covered supportively by the Scholag Legal Journal, including at the start of this year when the current changes in funding to postgraduate professional legal education were announced. It's regrettable that there was no consultation prior to this announcement, as representatives from universities and the professional and student bodies would have warmly welcomed such an opportunity, and their expert input might have laid the foundations of a sustainable and practical funding arrangement. And it certainly remains the case that the issue of proper and fair funding for professional legal education has not been dealt with satisfactorily. But this can be remedied, and I too support Sarah Boyack's call for a summit with those parties. The Government has stated that this is a budgetary decision, so therefore it's a choice. But the Government has also suggested that this decision won't be reversed. But this issue is too important to go unaddressed and unresolved, and I would ask the Minister to look at this again. Lack of certainty around funding is a major issue for students. Those undertaking undergraduate study need to know just how much postgraduate study will cost. And on a course where such postgraduate study is compulsory, this causes great uncertainty as to affordability for too many students. Our legal profession is an integral part of our systems of civil and criminal justice. It's the source of advice and representation for our citizens. Our judiciary is drawn from the profession, so it's hugely important that this profession must be open to and inclusive and representative of Scottish society in all its diversity. Abolition of the maintenance grant in 2010 and the replacement of the fees grant with a capped tuition fee loan of £3,400 means we are unlikely to achieve this diversity. And NUS Scotland has prioritised widening access to all levels of higher and further education. Their research shows that only just over 8% of the LLB intake comes from the 20% most deprived areas, and here in the city of this Parliament, as we've heard, we don't reach that lowly level. With tuition fees of up to £6,000 or more, with the government's own estimate of living costs at over £7,000, DPLP students are required to find £9,000 of their own or their family's money to study. For many people, this will be simply impossible without a commercial loan. Will all banks be willing to risk putting up cash when many students have no guaranteed traineeship? And what of the students themselves? They have to try to secure funding that will need to be repaid at commercial interest rates. As well as studying, students must try to secure a traineeship, and many will have to find work when their course timetable or possibly even childcare arrangements permit. To fund the majority of this compulsory qualification, we offer far greater support to other professions with similar training requirements. So it's unrealistic to suggest that this additional strain isn't going to affect the diversity of those seeking entrance to the profession. And it's absolutely right that we question on an ongoing basis whether our legal profession is fair, inclusive and representative. NUS Scotland state that there's a serious problem of access to law at the undergraduate level, and one which should concern all those who wish to see a more representative profession and judiciary. Lack of support at postgraduate level will exacerbate this. If financial status is a deciding factor or bar to entry, the profession cannot be said to be open to all, unless that is, as the Scholag Legal Journal points out, borrowing a phrase from Sir James Matthew LG, it is as open to all as the Ritz Hotel. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Drew Smith, after which we'll move to the Minister for the closing speech.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by congratulating Sarah Boyack on bringing forward this motion for debate by the Scottish Parliament. The issues have also been raised with me by students at Glasgow University, and many of the concerns are indeed common. So I want to use my time to talk about why we need people from the broadest range of background in legal practice. The law is not all about criminal defence, as Kezia Dugdale rightly reminds us, and we should be thankful for that. And neither is crime simply an issue for more disadvantaged communities. However, it is a fact, it does remain the case that people from less well-advantaged backgrounds are more likely to find themselves drawn into activities on the wrong side of the law. Equally, people living in these less advantaged areas are substantially more likely to be victims of many kinds of crime. Now, I'm not saying that you have to live on a council estate in order to understand these issues, and I'm sure David McCletchie will be pleased to hear that that isn't my argument. But just as in politics, Jenny Mara and Alison Johnson were right to remind us, it does help if those involved in our legal system actually recognise the communities and families they work with, rather than see them as a class apart. Now, the Minister will no doubt argue that a move from grants to loans to assist students studying for the legal diploma will allow us to support more individuals. But the Scottish Government must recognise that the widespread view of almost everyone else is that the changes will not result in a widening of the mix of people in the law. Now, since I assume that the Scottish Government accepts, because it is well evidenced, and Rod Campbell highlighted it, that the law remains a profession where the mix of people in practice is already not as it should be, it must then consider the criticisms that are being made of its policy extremely carefully. Students studying law are more likely to drop out of the subject if they come from a poorer background. Students from poorer families are more likely to be concerned about debt. They are then less likely, even at the moment, to try to obtain their diploma, because they are more concerned about whether they will find a traineeship at the end of it. Ultimately, they need to find a job with more urgency than others who can afford to take the traineeship risk. Legal traineeships are unbelievably difficult to find in the current environment, and it is to the Government's great discredit that this is a significant problem in schemes like the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, as well as in commercial practice. Faced with the likelihood of unemployment at the end of either their diploma, which is then of time-limited value, or at the end of a traineeship when they find they have been used as cheap labour and then disposed of for the next trainee, any new barrier on the route to legal practice will have the effect of making law graduates from less well-off backgrounds less likely to try and enter practice. This is a legitimate concern, and the Scottish Government should be listening to it. Now, I'm aware of law students who have argued that the Law Society should abandon the minimum recommended salary for legal trainees, because middle-class law graduates think that this is a barrier to small firms offering them traineeship opportunities. The implication of such a move for less well-off graduates are simply appalling, and this would serve to extend the inequities in the profession. Before closing, Presiding Officer, I also want to say to the Minister, to the Law Society, to the profession and the university, that in my view they must take heed of Sarah Boyat's call for a coming together which recognises that access is being eroded, and a clear action plan to ensure that at the end of this current recession we are not left with a legal community in this country which looks more like the law in the 1950s than it did in 2005. If that means thinking again about the move from grants to loans at this time, then the Government should consider it. Equally, if it means a change in the way in which we train lawyers, which questions whether a 7-year journey from undergraduate to practice-qualified solicitor is reasonable, even if we as a society are not prepared to support law students in a similar way to which we continue to do for medical students and others. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call on Dr Alistair Allen to wind up the debate on behalf of the Government. Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I say I'm grateful to Sarah Boyack for raising this matter in Parliament and for the very considered contributions of others, not least from David McLetchie, from Jenny Mara, to name but two. We have a long tradition in Scotland of aiming to provide excellent education, and that excellence is in abundance at the postgraduate end of the scale. And it has been a policy of this Government to support as many people as we can in this. Now, this plays a huge part in underpinning Scotland's international competitiveness, particularly when we can prioritise postgraduate study around some of the key subjects that are driving our economy and social improvements such as life sciences, engineering and teaching. And without minimising the financial pressure which clearly exists for many students, it is true to say Scotland is the only administration in these islands to provide support across a comprehensive list of postgraduate disciplines, including the subject that we are debating today, the law. Now, the Postgraduate Students' Allowance Scheme will this year support around 5,000 students studying over 450 postgraduate subjects at 18 institutions. However, that was not always the case. Support for law and other subjects has evolved over a number of years, and prior to the changes that we introduced 2 years ago after consultation with representatives of the universities and the Law Society, it should be said that the previous system only supported around 1,800 postgraduate students across Scotland with both living and fee costs. Now, in order to try and broaden this out, and remember that the total number of students in higher education in Scotland is nearly 300,000, the Government did remove the living cost element and used the money to support more students with their fees. This raised the number that we could help to around 2,700. Support was still provided on a discretionary basis, however, so this year we further developed the arrangements such that Scots domiciled and EU students following a designated course of study in 2012-13 can apply for, as has been debated, a non-means tested loan of up to £3,400, which can be put towards the cost of their tuition fees. Now, with this further improvement, we do estimate that the number of students benefiting from our postgraduate support arrangements will increase to around 5,000, of whom we estimate approximately 700 will be law students. Now, the Government is not, as has been suggested in the motion, promoting bigger numbers at the expense of wider access. And although, as Liam MacArthur and others have alluded to, there is clearly a need for the legal profession itself, perhaps, to give some more thought to how it supports people entering its profession. Widening access is a priority for this Government. We committed in our manifesto to introduce statutory agreements that would force the pace of change, and this will be taken forward in the post-16 bill that we plan to introduce to Parliament later in this session. Our priority on widening access, and bearing in mind that the resources available to do this are significant and we have to prioritise, is to get as many students as possible through a first degree at undergraduate level. That remains our objective, despite the budgetary pressures which Rod Campbell and others referred to. I give way.
Lewis MacDonald.
The Minister, will the Minister at least acknowledge the argument that by withdrawing support for living costs from postgraduate diploma law students, he has in fact limited their ability to access that course, and that's something that perhaps would bear looking at again?
Minister.
Well, the Government always wants to keep up a dialogue with students and with the profession on this, but it has to be recognised that in Scotland we do have what is widely recognised by the National Union of Students themselves and others as the best package of student support available in the UK. Now, what this means in practice is that our students will finish their first degrees with, on average, less than half the level of debt built up by students studying in England. And completing their first degree with a relatively low amount of debt is therefore the starting point for our postgraduates. The universities are, of course, autonomous bodies, a point which is relevant to an earlier point which Lewis MacDonald made when he made some interesting suggestions about reforming the shape of law degrees themselves. However, in Scotland this year, we are funding 400 more undergraduate places at a time when the number of acceptances at English universities has fallen by nearly 50,000 as a direct result, no, I'm concluding, as a direct result of the policies the UK government and their betrayal of a generation of students through the introduction of fees there. Budgetary realities mean that we are not able to provide living cost support to postgraduates on top of the fee support and teaching grant that we already provide. However, in conclusion, after postgraduate students have met their own living costs, they will still have less debt than many ordinary graduates elsewhere in the UK. That's the reality of how we support higher education in Scotland. It is not to minimise the financial pressures on individual students. But I again thank Ms Boyack for raising these important issues in Parliament, and the dialogue with the student body and the profession will continue.
Thank you very much. I now suspend this meeting of Parliament until 2:30.